The August sun hung merciless over Haskell County, Kansas, turning the wheat fields into oceans of gold that rippled under a wind too hot to bring relief. While every farmer in the county was calculating their losses from two failed harvests, while every wife was stretching flour and hope in equal measure, Cordelia Ashford stood at the edge of a dried-up well and stared into darkness. She was 50 years old, a widow for 2 years, childless by circumstance, not choice, after 3 pregnancies that ended in grief before any of the babies could draw breath. And in exactly 14 weeks, she would lose everything she had left in this world. Her hands were calloused from 23 years of farm work, her face weathered by Kansas sun and Kansas wind, her body still strong despite the gray that had begun to thread through her dark hair. She was not a beautiful woman by the standards of the magazines that sometimes made their way to Cedar Bend, but there was something in her face that made people look twice, a steadiness, a quiet determination that had seen her through losses that would have broken weaker souls. But the men who were coming to take her land did not know what Cordelia knew. They did not know what her husband had taught her in the years before the mine collapse took him. They did not know about the cavity in the limestone 20 feet below the surface, or the way the earth keeps its secrets warm even when the sky turns to murder. They called her the crazy widow of Ashford Farm. They would learn soon enough to call her something else entirely. The letter had arrived 3 days earlier, delivered by a boy on a mule who would not meet her eyes. Cordelia had known what it contained before she broke the seal. Bad news always traveled with its head down. She had taken the envelope into the kitchen, the room where she and Ezra had shared 10,000 meals, where they had planned their futures and mourned their losses and laughed at jokes that no one else would have understood. The afternoon light slanted through the window, catching dust motes that danced in the still air, and Cordelia had thought irrationally that she should sweep before reading whatever was inside. She did not sweep. She sat down at the table, smoothed the envelope with hands that were only slightly trembling, and broke the seal. The words were formal, precise, and devastating. Due to the failure to meet payment obligations on the outstanding loan secured against the property known as the Ashford Homestead, the First Bank of Haskell County hereby provides notice of foreclosure proceedings to commence in 14 weeks from the date of this letter. All persons residing on said property must vacate by the specified date or face forcible removal by agents of the court. Signed with a flourish that seemed almost cheerful, Virgil Hutchins, President, First Bank of Haskell County. Cordelia read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in her apron pocket, and walked out to the well where her husband had proposed to her 23 years ago. The well had gone dry 5 years back, during the drought that had broken so many farms in the county. Ezra had gone down to investigate, hoping to dig deeper and—
Cordelia, I know you're down there. Please, my children are freezing. Open it just for a minute. If you don't help us, we won't make it.
Find water again. Instead, he had found something else entirely. Cora, he had said that night, his eyes bright with a miner's excitement, there's a cavity down there. Natural limestone cave, maybe 10 feet across. The kind we used to find in Cornwall, back in the old country. Ezra Ashford had spent 20 years in the tin mines of Cornwall before sailing to America with nothing but his mining skills and a young wife who believed in him. He had traded darkness for sunlight, tunnels for wheat fields, but the knowledge had never left him. He could read stone the way other men read newspapers. He could sense the structure of the earth beneath his feet, the hidden cavities and fault lines that lay waiting below the surface. In the evenings after the farm work was done, Ezra used to sit on the porch with Cordelia and tell her stories of the mines. Not the horror stories, not the cave-ins and the explosions, and the men who never came home. He told her the other stories, the ones about survival, about the deep tunnels where miners had sheltered during floods, about the ancient knowledge of how the earth could protect those who understood her ways. The earth remembers, he used to tell her, his Cornish accent still thick after all his years in America. 20 feet down, the temperature stays the same all year. 54 degrees, summer or winter. The Cornish miners knew this. We used to take shelter in the deep tunnels when the storms came. The earth kept us warm when everything above turned to ice. Cordelia had listened to these stories the way one listens to fairy tales, enjoying them without quite believing. She understood now that Ezra had not been telling stories. He had been teaching her, preparing her for a future he sensed was coming, even if he could not say when. Copper, the old hound dog who had been Ezra's shadow for 9 years, pressed his graying muzzle against Cordelia's hand as she stood at the well's edge. The dog was 12 now, slow and stiff in the mornings. His once copper coat faded to a dusty brown, but his eyes were still sharp, still watchful. He had grieved for Ezra in the way that dogs grieve, refusing food for days, sleeping on his side of the bed until Cordelia finally moved back into the room they had shared. Copper was the last living connection to her husband. Every time the old dog looked at her with those patient brown eyes, Cordelia saw Ezra looking back. "He's down there somewhere, isn't he, boy?" Cordelia whispered. "Still teaching me, even now." She looked across the fields toward town. The wheat rippled in the hot August wind, already showing the yellow of drought stress, already forecasting another failed harvest. Somewhere in that cluster of buildings, Virgil Hutchins was sitting in his office with his ledgers and his foreclosure notices, already counting her land as his own. The man had wanted this property for years. It was prime farmland, with good drainage and a natural windbreak of cottonwood trees along the northern edge. The creek that ran through the southwest corner never went completely dry, even in the worst droughts. And the location was perfect, close enough to town for easy access, but far enough for privacy. Hutchins had made Ezra an offer once, back when the well was still good and the harvests were strong. A generous offer, by some standards, though not generous enough to account for the years of labor Ezra had invested in the land. Ezra had refused. "That man doesn't want to farm this land," Ezra had said that night, his face set in the stubborn lines that Cordelia knew meant his mind was made up. "He wants to own it. There's a difference. A farmer works the land, cares for it, passes it on better than he found it. Hutchins just wants to put his name on the deed and watch the money roll in. I won't be part of that." Hutchins had not taken the refusal well. He had stopped greeting Ezra on the street, had spread rumors about the Ashford farm being poorly
I was terrified. I chose wrong. I'm begging you, please don't punish my children for my sins.
managed, had done what he could to make their lives difficult without ever crossing the line into anything actionable. Now Ezra was dead, and Hutchins had found his moment. But Cordelia Ashford was not ready to surrender. Not yet. Not while she still remembered everything her husband had taught her about surviving in the dark. She went down the well that same night after the sun had set, and the neighbors could not see her movements. Copper whined at the well's edge as she descended the rope ladder Ezra had left behind, the lantern swinging from her belt, casting wild shadows on the stone walls. The well shaft was lined with fitted limestone, each stone placed by Ezra's careful hands when he had first dug it 7 years ago. The craftsmanship was beautiful even now, the stones fitting together so precisely that they needed no mortar. The whole structure as solid as if it had been carved from a single piece of rock. 20 feet down, the air changed. It grew cooler, damper, and carried the smell of ancient rock, the smell of time itself pressed into stone. Cordelia's feet touched the bottom of the well shaft, and she held up the lantern to illuminate the space beyond. The cavity was exactly as Ezra had described it, a natural hollow in the limestone, roughly 10 feet across and 6 feet high, with walls that sparkled faintly in the lamplight, where crystals had formed over millions of years. The floor was dry, covered with a fine silt that had settled over the centuries. The ceiling was solid, with no cracks or fissures that might indicate weakness. A perfect pocket in the earth, waiting. Cordelia walked the perimeter slowly, running her hand along the stone walls, testing their solidity. The limestone was good quality, hard and dense, the kind of stone that could bear weight without crumbling. This was not a cave that would collapse with the first vibration. This was a space that had existed for thousands of years and would exist for thousands more. "If anything ever happens to me," Ezra had told her once, on a winter night when the wind was howling outside and they were snug by the fire, "and you find yourself with nowhere to go, remember this place. The earth will keep you warm when everything else fails." Cordelia had thought he was being morbid. She had changed the subject, made him laugh, pushed the conversation aside like so many uncomfortable truths. Now she understood. Ezra had known. Somehow, in the way that men who work in dangerous places come to know such things, He had sensed that his time was limited, and he had left her this final gift: a hiding place, a shelter, a chance. The next morning, Cordelia walked to town for the first time in weeks. She needed supplies and she needed information. But more than anything, she needed to look Virgil Hutchins in the eye and let him believe she was beaten. The walk took nearly an hour, the road dusty and rutted from the summer's lack of rain. Cordelia passed the Henderson farm, where the corn was already browning in the fields. She passed the old Miller place, abandoned 2 years ago when the family gave up and moved to Kansas City. She passed the cemetery where Ezra lay, and she did not allow herself to look. The streets of Cedar Bend were dusty and quiet when she arrived. 2 years of poor harvests had taken their toll. The general store had half-empty shelves with prices marked up to account for scarcity. The saloon had more flies than customers, its piano silent in the morning heat. The blacksmith's forge was cold, waiting for business that might never come. Only the bank looked prosperous, its fresh paint gleaming like an insult against the faded storefronts of its neighbors. The windows were clean, the brass door handles polished, the American flag hanging limp in the still air. Everything about the building said money in a town that had precious little of it. Cordelia pushed through the bank's doors and asked to see Mr. Hutchins. The clerk, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers and a collar too tight for his neck, disappeared into the back office. A moment later, Virgil Hutchins emerged, his smile as thin and sharp as a paper cut. "Mrs. Ashford, I was wondering when you would come to see me." He was 55 years old with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and the kind of face that had learned to appear sympathetic while calculating profit margins. He wore a suit that cost more than most farmers earned in a month, gray wool with a silver watch chain draped across the vest. His hands were soft and uncalloused, the hands of a man who had never done a day of physical labor in his life. "I received your letter," Cordelia said. Her voice was steady, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Ah, yes, unfortunate business." Hutchins shook his head with practiced regret, the gesture so polished it might have been rehearsed in a mirror. "Truly, Mrs. Ashford, I wish there were another way. But the bank has its obligations, shareholders to satisfy, you understand. I have 14 weeks. Indeed you do. 14 weeks to the day." He paused, letting the precision of the number sink in. "Though I must tell you, as a friend, that hope—"
You don't deserve this.
But they do!
Bring them down, quickly, and keep your voice low, before someone sees.
Hoping for a miracle in 14 weeks seems rather optimistic. A woman alone, no family to speak of, no means of income, no husband to provide guidance. He spread his hands in a gesture of helpless resignation, palms up, as if the situation were entirely beyond his control. "Perhaps it would be better for everyone if you simply accepted the inevitable now. I could arrange for the transition to be smooth, even provide a small sum to help you relocate. Say $50, enough for a train ticket and a few months' rent in a boarding house somewhere." Cordelia met his eyes without blinking. "And where would I go?" "Well, that would be your affair, wouldn't it? Kansas City has boarding houses, or perhaps you have relatives back east. A sister, an aunt. Surely there must be someone who could take you in." "I have no one back east. Everyone I had is buried in the cemetery behind the Methodist church." Hutchins' smile flickered, just for a moment, before he reassembled it into an expression of professional sympathy. "Then I truly am sorry, but business is business, Mrs. Ashford. The loan is overdue. The collateral must be collected. I'm sure you understand that I have no personal animosity toward you. This is simply the way these things work." Cordelia nodded slowly, as if accepting defeat. She needed him to believe she was broken. She needed him to stop watching. 14 weeks, she said quietly. "I will be gone by then." "Excellent. I knew you would be reasonable." Hutchins reached out to pat her shoulder, a gesture of false comfort that made her skin crawl. His hand was cool and dry, like touching a fish. "It's for the best, really. A widow has no place trying to run a farm alone. It's simply not natural. The Lord made women to be helpmeets, not heads of households." Cordelia turned and walked out of the bank without another word. Behind her, she heard Hutchins chuckling to himself, the sound of a man who believed he had already won. He had no idea what she was about to do. If you were Cordelia, standing at the edge of losing everything, Would you dare to trust the words of a dead man and climb down into the darkness? Would you bet your life on a hole in the ground? Think about what you would do. And if you want to find out what Cordelia chose, keep listening. The work began that very night. Cordelia changed into Ezra's old work clothes, the ones she had not been able to give away after his death. They were too big for her, but they were sturdy and practical, and wearing them made her feel closer to him. She gathered rope, a shovel, a pickaxe, and the small camping lantern that burned kerosene with a steady, reliable flame. Copper watched her preparations with his head tilted, sensing something significant, but unable to understand what. When she headed toward the well, he followed without hesitation. "You can't come down with me, boy," Cordelia told him. "Not tonight, but you can keep watch. Bark if anyone comes." The dog settled at the well's edge, his graying muzzle resting on his paws, his eyes fixed on the road to town. Cordelia descended into the earth. The first week was the hardest. Cordelia's body was strong from years of farm work, but mining was different. The confined space pressed against her from all sides, making every movement deliberate and careful. The constant dampness seeped into her clothes and her joints, leaving her stiff and aching by the end of each night's work. And always, there was the weight of the earth pressing down from above, 20 feet of stone and soil that could collapse at any moment if she made a wrong move. Every swing of the pickaxe reminded her that she was working against millions of years of geology with nothing but human will. But she was also working with knowledge that had been refined over centuries in the tin mines of Cornwall. Ezra had taught her well. She knew how to read the stone, how to trace the subtle discolorations that indicated natural fault lines where the limestone would give way more easily. She knew how to test the ceiling by sound, tapping with the pickaxe handle and listening for the hollow echo that meant weakness, the solid thunk that meant strength. She knew how to shore up the walls as she went, using salvaged timber from the abandoned barn behind the farmhouse, creating supports that would distribute the weight evenly and prevent collapse. She worked methodically, expanding the cavity foot by foot, inch by inch. Each night she descended with her tools and her lamp. Each night she carved away another small section of stone. Each morning she climbed back up, exhausted and filthy, just as the first light was touching the eastern horizon. By the end of the first week, she had widened the space to 12 feet across. Her hands were blistered and bleeding, the skin torn away by the rough handles of her tools. Her muscles screamed with exhaustion every morning, protesting the abuse with cramps and spasms that made even simple tasks difficult. Her back ached constantly, a deep bone weariness that no amount of rest seemed to touch. But the chamber was taking shape, and no one knew. Opal Beckford came to visit on the 8th day. Cordelia saw her approaching from the kitchen window and felt her stomach drop. She quickly changed out of her work clothes, hiding the dirt and sweat under a clean dress, washing her hands and face in the basin by the back door. The calluses on her palms were new and obvious, but there was nothing she could do about those. She met Opal on the front porch with a forced smile, hoping she looked like nothing more than a grieving widow struggling to maintain a failing farm. "Cordelia, dear." Opal embraced her with the aggressive affection of a woman who thrived on other people's misfortunes. Her perfume was overwhelming, something floral and cloying that seemed designed to announce her presence from 50 feet away. "I heard about the foreclosure. I came as soon as I could. You poor thing." Opal was 45 years old, a neighbor for the past 10 years, and the closest thing Cordelia had to a friend in Cedar Bend. They had shared recipes and garden advice, had helped each other through illnesses and difficult.
You don't deserve this. But they do. Bring them down, quickly, and keep your voice low before someone sees.
Harvests. Opal had brought a casserole when Ezra died, had sat with Cordelia through the funeral, had said all the right things about loss and grief and the passage of time. She was also the biggest gossip in 3 counties, a fact that Cordelia had always tolerated but never trusted. Opal collected information the way some women collected china, carefully acquiring each new piece and displaying it to maximum effect. "News travels fast," Cordelia said, keeping her voice neutral. "Oh, honey, everyone knows. That horrible Virgil Hutchins has been telling anyone who will listen. He's already talking about what he'll do with your land once he gets it." Opal lowered her voice conspiratorially, leaning in so close that Cordelia could smell the coffee on her breath. They say he wants to expand his cattle operation, turn the whole property into grazing land. Can you imagine? All of Ezra's hard work turned into a pasture for cows. Cordelia felt a flash of anger, hot and bright, rising in her chest. Ezra had spent 7 years breaking this ground, coaxing crops from soil that had never known a plow. He had worked from dawn to dark, through drought and flood and plague of locusts, building something from nothing. The thought of cattle trampling over his work made her want to scream, but she swallowed the rage and kept her voice mild. I suppose there's nothing I can do about it. Well, that's why I came. Opal leaned in eagerly, her eyes bright with barely contained excitement. I want to help, Cordelia. Truly. If there's anything you're planning, any way to fight back, you can tell me. I'll keep your secrets. You know I will. Cordelia looked into Opal's eyes and saw the hunger there, naked and unmistakable. This woman did not want to help. She wanted information. She wanted to be the first to know what the crazy widow was planning so she could spread the news and bask in the attention. It was, Cordelia realized, exactly what Opal had always been. The casseroles and the sympathy had never been about friendship. They had been about access, about positioning herself to know things that others did not. I'm not planning anything, Cordelia said carefully. The bank holds the note. The law is on their side. I'll be gone by the deadline. Opal's face fell just slightly before she rearranged it into an expression of sympathy. Of course you will. It's the sensible thing. She patted Cordelia's hand with fingers that were soft and cool. And where will you go? Do you have family somewhere? I'm not sure yet. Maybe West. Maybe California. California! Opal's eyes widened with theatrical surprise. Oh, how exciting! You'll have to write me letters. Tell me all about it. Of course, Cordelia lied. I'll write you every week. After Opal left, Cordelia sat on the porch and watched the dust from her departure settle on the road. Copper came to rest his head in her lap, and she stroked his ears absently. She's going to tell everyone I'm leaving for California, Cordelia murmured, which means Hutchins will stop watching. He'll think I've given up. The dog whined softly as if he understood. But we're not giving up, are we, boy? We're just getting started. The work continued. By the end of the 3rd week, Cordelia had expanded the chamber to 15 feet long and 12 feet wide. She had lined the walls with stones gathered from the creek bed, mortared together with a mixture of clay and dried grass that Ezra had taught her to make. The floor was hard-packed earth, the ceiling shored up with overlapping planks covered in canvas she had waterproofed with rendered animal fat. The ventilation system was the trickiest part. Cordelia could not simply run a stovepipe straight up the well shaft. The smoke would be visible, the metal pipe a dead giveaway to anyone who looked down from above. Instead, she created a hidden channel along the inside of the well's stone lining. The smoke would travel up through this channel, emerging through a series of baffles made from thin slabs of limestone that would disperse it gradually into the well shaft. From there, it would rise naturally with the warm air, invisible against the sky. She tested it on a cold October night, burning a small fire in the camp stove she had brought down. The smoke disappeared exactly as planned. From the surface, there was nothing to see. It works, she whispered to herself in the darkness. Ezra, my love, it works. The first skeptic arrived in early October. Dr. Phineas Mercer was the only physician in Cedar Bend, a 50-year-old man with a medical degree from Philadelphia and an unshakable conviction that he knew better than everyone else in the county about everything. He came to the Ashford farm under the pretense of checking on Cordelia's health. The real purpose, as she quickly realized, was to assess her mental state. Mrs. Ashford, he said, sitting in her parlor with his bag of instruments beside him, there have been some concerns expressed about your well-being. Concerns from whom? Various members of the community. Mrs. Beckford mentioned that you seemed distracted when she visited. Deputy Crenshaw reports that you've been seen carrying tools and supplies around the property at odd hours. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Some people are worried that the stress of your situation may be affecting your judgment. Cordelia kept her expression neutral. I've been doing repairs around the farm. Is that unusual? Repairs? What sort of repairs? The barn needs work. The fences are falling down. I may be losing this place, doctor, but I won't let it fall apart while I'm still here. Dr. Mercer studied her for a long moment. Mrs. Ashford, I must be frank with you. Grief can do strange things to a person. Combined with the pressure of financial difficulties, it can sometimes lead to behavior that seems rational to the individual, but appears quite troubling to outside observers. Are you saying I'm going crazy, doctor? I'm saying that hysteria in widows is a well-documented medical phenomenon. If you were to experience symptoms, confusion, delusions, irrational attachments to lost causes, it would not be shameful. It would simply be an illness requiring treatment. Cordelia stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. Dr. Mercer, I appreciate your concern. Truly I do. But I am not suffering from hysteria, and I am not delusional. I am a woman preparing to leave the only home I've ever known, and I am doing so with as much dignity as I can manage. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. The doctor left without examining her, his expression a mixture of frustration and concern. Cordelia watched him go, knowing that he would report back to whoever had sent him, Hutchins most likely. Or perhaps Opal, eager to have her suspicions confirmed. It did not matter. Let them think she was losing her mind. Let them write her off as a crazy widow with no hope and no plan. The less they watched, the more she could accomplish. November came, and with it the first real cold of the year. Cordelia had finished the main chamber by then. It was a remarkable space, carved from living rock and lined with the patient labor of a woman who refused to surrender. The walls were solid stone and mortar, fitted together with the same precision that Ezra had used in building the well shaft. She had learned his techniques by watching him work over 20 years of marriage, and now those observations paid dividends in every carefully placed stone. The ceiling was sturdy timber, covered with layers of canvas.
Cordelia, I know you're down there. Please, my children are freezing. Open it just for a minute. If you don't help us, we won't make it.
She had waterproofed with rendered animal fat, then more timber, then flat stones gathered from the creek bed, then packed earth. The multiple layers created insulation that would trap heat in winter and keep the space cool in summer. More importantly, they would muffle any sound from below, ensuring that footsteps on the surface would not reveal the hollow space beneath. A small iron stove, salvaged from a traveling peddler's wagon for $3 and a jar of preserved peaches, sat in one corner. It was a compact thing, designed for the tight quarters of a chuck wagon, but it burned efficiently and produced steady heat with minimal fuel. The flue system had been the most challenging part of the project, requiring 3 weeks of careful work to ensure the smoke would disperse without being detected. Along one wall, she had built a narrow bed from planks and a corn husk mattress, covered with every blanket and quilt she owned. The bed was only 2 feet wide, but it was sufficient. Cordelia had grown used to sleeping alone since Ezra's death, and the confined space felt almost comforting, like being held. Along another wall stood shelves holding her supplies, jars of preserved vegetables that gleamed in the lamplight like jewels, sacks of dried beans tied shut with twine, barrels of flour and salt pork, dried apples hanging in cloth bags from the ceiling beams. She had been preserving and stockpiling since August, working through the nights to put up every scrap of food she could manage. The shelves represented 3 months of frantic labor, 3 months of pretending to be a beaten woman while secretly preparing for war. The sanitation chamber was a separate space, accessed through a low wooden door that she had hung with leather hinges. Inside was a wooden seat positioned over a deep pit filled with alternating layers of sand and wood ash. Ezra had described the system in detail, explaining how it was used in the deep Cornish mines where men might spend days underground without returning to the surface. The sand absorbed liquid, the ash controlled odor and aided decomposition, and the combination created a surprisingly sanitary system that would last through even a long winter. It was not pleasant, but it was functional and would last through months of use if necessary. Water remained her biggest challenge. The well itself was dry, so she would have to make regular trips to the spring a quarter-mile distant. It was a risk being seen above ground, but there was no alternative. She would go only after dark, carrying 2 buckets at a time, and the natural coolness of the chamber would keep the water fresh for days. She had thought of everything she could think of. Now she could only wait and hope it would be enough. Cordelia spent 3 months building her underground shelter alone. She dug through solid rock with nothing but hand tools. She lined walls with stone. She created a hidden ventilation system that even trained engineers would admire. All while the town above her thought she was going crazy. Have you ever worked on something that everyone told you was impossible? Something that only you believed in? Think about that as you listen to what happens next. On the 15th of November, exactly on the deadline specified in Hutchins' letter, Cordelia Ashford disappeared. She had spent the previous week moving the last of her supplies down into the chamber. The farmhouse was stripped bare now, nothing left but empty rooms and dust. She locked the door behind her for the last time, knowing that she would never enter it again. Copper followed her to the well without hesitation. He was old and stiff, but he made the climb down the rope ladder with the determination of a dog who refused to be separated from his person. Cordelia settled him on a folded blanket near the stove, and he curled up with a sigh of contentment. "This is home now, boy," she told him, "for as long as it takes." Above them, the winter wind was beginning to howl. Virgil Hutchins arrived at the Ashford property on the morning of November the 16th with Deputy Silas Crenshaw and 2 hired men. They found the farmhouse empty, the barn abandoned, and no sign of the widow anywhere. "Looks like she kept her word," Hutchins said, unable to hide his satisfaction. "Gone to California, just like she said." Deputy Crenshaw, a sharp-eyed man of 35 who took his job more seriously than most, walked the property slowly. Something felt wrong to him, though he could not quite identify what. "Her dog is gone too," he observed. "She must have taken it with her." Sentimental attachment to the animal. Women are prone to such things. Crenshaw stopped at the edge of the old well, looking down into the darkness. "This well's been dry for years, hasn't it?" "5 years at least. Useless now." Hutchins was already walking toward the farmhouse, mentally calculating its value as a teardown. "Post a man here for a few weeks, just in case she changes her mind and tries to come back. I want to make sure this transition is smooth." "Yes, sir." That night, Deputy Silas Crenshaw sat on an overturned bucket beside the dry well, smoking a cigarette and watching the stars wheel overhead. 20 feet below him, separated by nothing but stone and darkness and silence, Cordelia Ashford lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sound of his breathing. She did not sleep that night. Neither did Copper, whose ears twitched at every sound from above. But they made no noise, and they were not discovered. The waiting had begun. December in Kansas arrived like a punishment from an angry god. The first real blizzard struck on the 3rd of December, dropping 18 inches of snow in 2 days and sending temperatures plunging to 20 below zero. Cordelia watched the storm through a small periscope device she had constructed from mirrors and a length of pipe, her breath forming clouds in the dim light of the chamber. Above ground, the world had become a frozen wasteland. Below, the temperature held steady at 48 degrees. "It's working, Ezra," she whispered. "Everything you taught me is working." She had settled into a routine by then. Wake at what she judged to be dawn, though there was no way to see the sun. Light the stove, heat water for coffee and washing. Cook a simple breakfast of porridge or dried beans. Spend the morning reading from the small collection of books she had brought down, or writing in the journal she had started on her first night underground. Afternoons were for maintenance, checking the ventilation system, inspecting the walls for any signs of moisture or instability, reorganizing her supplies to make them last as long as possible. Evenings were for remembering, for talking to Copper about better times, for allowing herself to feel the weight of everything she had lost. The loneliness was the hardest part. Cordelia had lived alone since Ezra's death, but the farmhouse had been filled with memories, with the physical evidence of their life together. Down here, there was only stone and darkness and the constant, pressing awareness of the earth above her head. She talked to Copper constantly. She talked to Ezra, too, in the quiet moments when the silence became too heavy to bear. "I'm not giving up," she told his memory. "I promised you I wouldn't, and I'm keeping that promise. But Lord, Ezra, it's hard, it's so hard." Copper would press his warm body against her legs when she spoke like this, as if he understood. Perhaps he did. Dogs know grief better than most people realize. Deputy Crenshaw remained at the property for 3 weeks. Cordelia learned his patterns quickly. He arrived in the late afternoon, checked the farmhouse and barn, then settled in for the night in the small shed near the well. He smoked constantly, cheap tobacco that she could smell even 20 feet below ground. He talked to himself sometimes, complaining about the cold, about Hutchins, about this miserable assignment, watching an empty farm. Most nights he would walk to the well's edge and look down into the darkness. The first time he did this, Cordelia's heart nearly stopped. She had extinguished her lamp, pressed herself against the wall of the chamber, and held her breath for what felt like an eternity. But there was nothing to see. The well was just a well, dry and empty and unremarkable. "Crazy old woman," she heard Crenshaw mutter one night, running off to California in November. Probably froze to death on the trail. Cordelia smiled in the darkness. On the 14th of December, Crenshaw finally stopped coming. Cordelia gave it 3 more days before she risked her first trip to the surface. She emerged just after midnight, the cold hitting her like a physical blow after weeks in the stable warmth of the chamber. The snow was deep, the sky brilliant with stars, the world utterly silent. She moved quickly to the spring, filled her buckets, and hurried back to the well. The round trip took less than an hour, but she was shaking with cold and fear by the time she descended the ladder again. But she had water, and she had confirmed that no one was watching anymore. Cordelia spent 14 weeks alone in a hole in the ground, 20 feet beneath the earth, while the world above her forgot she existed. She talked to her dog. She wrote in her journal. She survived. Could you do the same? Could you endure that kind of loneliness for the chance to save everything you had left? Think about it, and keep listening to find out what happened when the real storm finally came. Christmas came and went, marked only by a small candle lit in Ezra's memory and a prayer spoken into the darkness. Cordelia had saved a few treats for the occasion: a small piece of dried apple pie filling she had preserved in a jar, a tin of sugar cookies that was her last remaining luxury, a tiny bottle of blackberry wine that Ezra had made 3 summers ago. She had found the bottle in the back of the cellar when she was preparing to leave the farmhouse, tucked behind other jars as if it had been forgotten. But Ezra never forgot anything. He had put it there for her to find. She was certain of it. One more gift from a husband who had known he was running out of time. She opened the bottle and poured a small measure into a tin cup. The wine was sweet and dark, tasting of summer sunshine and the small joys of ordinary life. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she drank it, but she did not wipe them away. "Merry Christmas, Ezra," she whispered to the stone walls. "Merry Christmas, my love." She shared the cookies with Copper, who accepted them with the dignified appreciation of a dog who understood the significance of the moment. He was moving more slowly now, the cold seeping into his old bones despite the warmth of the chamber. Cordelia knew that he would not see another Christmas, knew that the same failing body that had carried him faithfully for 12 years was beginning to shut down. She held him close, feeling his heartbeat against her chest, and allowed herself to grieve for all the losses that were coming. "Thank you for staying with me, boy," she whispered into his fur. "Thank you for not leaving me alone." Copper's tail thumped once against the blanket, as if he understood, as if he was telling her that he would stay as long as he could. On New Year's Eve, Cordelia sang hymns to herself in the darkness. "Amazing grace, rock of ages, come thou fount of every blessing." The songs echoed strangely in the stone chamber, bouncing off walls that had never heard human voices before. Copper raised his head at the sound, his eyes bright in the lamplight, and something that might have been a smile crossed his graying muzzle. When she finished, the silence seemed deeper but somehow less oppressive. The music had reminded her that she was still connected to the world above, still part of a community even if that community had abandoned her. "We're going to make it," she told Copper. "I don't know how yet, but we're going to make it." January arrived, and with it came a warmth that made no sense. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, Cordelia emerged for her regular water run and found the air balmy and mild. The temperature must have been close to 40 degrees, a remarkable warmth for mid-January in Kansas. The snow was softening, dripping from tree branches, turning the roads to mud. She hurried to the spring, filled her buckets, and was about to return to the well when she noticed old Hetty Briggs walking toward her across the field. Cordelia froze. She had not spoken to another human being in 2 months. The sight of Hetty, the oldest woman in Cedar Bend, approaching with purpose in her step, sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Hetty stopped a few feet away, her weathered face unreadable. She was 78 years old, had outlived 3 husbands and 7 of her 12 children, and was known throughout the county for her sharp tongue and sharper memory. "You're still here," Hetty said. It was not a question. Cordelia said nothing. "Thought so. Saw your tracks in the snow last week. Fresh tracks, going to the spring and back. Knew it had to be you. Are you going to tell anyone?" Hetty was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving across the landscape toward town. 60 years ago, I knew a woman from Cornwall. Came over on the same ship as my second husband. She told me about the mines there, about the ways the old folks had of surviving underground when the storms came. What are you saying? I'm saying I recognize what you're doing, Mrs. Ashford, and I'm saying your secret is safe with me. Hetty's voice dropped. But I'm also saying you need to get below ground right now. Today. Don't come up again until this is over. Until what is over? Hetty looked at the sky, at the unnaturally warm air, at the melting snow. Her face was grave. I've only seen weather like this once before. January of 1856, 3 days of warmth, then the sky turned green, and 40 people died in the storm that followed. Cordelia felt the blood drain from her face. A blizzard. Worse than a blizzard. When the cold front hits this warm air, it's going to be like nothing you've ever seen. Fast, mean, and deadly. Anyone caught outside when it comes... Hetty shook her head. Get below, Mrs. Ashford. Get below and stay there. She turned and walked away without another word. Cordelia hurried back to the well with her buckets of water, her heart pounding. The warmth that had seemed pleasant just minutes ago now felt sinister, like a trap being set. She made 2 more water runs that morning, filling every container she had. She gathered extra firewood, checked her food supplies, tested the ventilation system one more time. By noon, she had done everything she could think of to prepare. Then she descended into the earth and pulled the well cover closed above her. It's coming, Copper, she whispered to the dog, who had sensed her anxiety and was pressed close against her legs. Something bad is coming. They sat together in the dim light of the lamp, listening to the sounds of a world that did not know what was about to happen. The storm arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Cordelia was reading from her worn copy of the Bible when the first sounds reached her. A distant roaring, like a train approaching from very far away. The roaring grew louder, closer, until it seemed to surround the well shaft like a living thing trying to force its way in. She climbed halfway up the rope ladder and pressed her ear to the well cover. What she heard made her blood run cold. Wind. Not the steady wind of a normal storm, but a screaming, howling fury that sounded like the end of the world. Through the small gaps around the well cover, she could feel the temperature dropping with impossible speed. Minutes ago, it had been 40 degrees. Now it was plunging toward 0 and still falling. Cordelia retreated to the chamber and lit the stove. Copper was whining, his old body trembling with instinctive fear. She gathered him close, wrapped them both in blankets, and waited. Above them, the children's blizzard of 1888 was about to kill 235 people across the Great Plains. The storm raged for 2 days. Cordelia kept careful track of time by the marks she made on the wall, but even so, it was difficult to know how many hours had passed. The sounds from above were constant and terrifying. The shriek of wind, the crack of breaking timber, the occasional thud of something heavy striking the ground. The temperature inside the chamber dropped to 45 degrees, the coldest it had been since she had moved in. She kept the stove burning constantly, rationing her wood but not willing to let the fire go out. Copper curled into a tight ball of fur beside her, his graying muzzle tucked under his tail. On the first night of the storm, disaster nearly struck. Cordelia woke from a restless sleep to find the air thick and acrid, her lungs burning with each breath. Smoke. The chamber was filling with smoke. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding with terror, and checked the stove. The fire was burning normally, but the smoke that should have been traveling up through the hidden flue was billowing back into the room. The ventilation pipe was blocked. She grabbed her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and climbed the ladder with a hammer and chisel tucked into her belt. At the top, she pressed her ear to the well cover and heard the storm raging with apocalyptic fury. The temperature out there was deadly, 30 below zero at least, maybe 40. Anyone exposed for more than a few minutes would die. But if she did not clear the blockage, she and Copper would suffocate before morning. Cordelia pushed the well cover aside and was nearly knocked off the ladder by the force of the wind. Ice crystals drove into her exposed skin like needles. The cold was beyond anything she had ever experienced, a physical assault that seemed to be trying to crush the life out of her. She climbed out of the well and found the problem immediately. Ice had formed in the upper portion of the ventilation channel, a thick plug of frozen condensation that was blocking the airflow completely. The smoke had nowhere to go. Working by feel alone in the pitch darkness, her fingers already numb despite her gloves, Cordelia began to chip away at the ice. The hammer blows echoed strangely in the howling wind, swallowed almost instantly by the storm's fury. Each strike sent shards of ice flying into her face. Each second she spent above ground brought her closer to frostbite, to hypothermia, to death. It took 15 minutes to clear the blockage. 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours. By the time she climbed back down the ladder and pulled the cover closed above her, she could no longer feel her hands or feet. Her face was raw and burning where the wind had scoured away the outer layer of skin. But the smoke was clearing. The ventilation system was working again. Cordelia crawled to the stove and pressed her frozen hands against its warm iron surface, weeping with relief and pain as the feeling slowly returned. Copper limped over to her and pressed his body against her legs, sharing what warmth he could. "We almost died, boy," she whispered. "We almost died up there." From now on, she would check the ventilation pipe every few hours, no matter what. The storm had nearly killed her, not through cold, but through her own oversight. She would not make that mistake again. On the second night, she heard something that made her heart stop. Voices, faint and distant, but unmistakably human. People calling for help, their cries swallowed by the wind. Cordelia pressed her hands over her ears, unable to bear the sound. There was nothing she could do. If she tried to leave the chamber now, she would die within minutes. The cold above was killing temperatures, the kind of cold that turned exposed skin to frostbite in seconds. She had to stay hidden. She had to survive, even if it meant listening to others suffer. "Forgive me," she whispered into the darkness. "Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me." On the third day, the wind finally began to die. Cordelia waited another full day before she attempted to go above ground. When she finally pushed aside the well cover and emerged into the light, she found a world transformed. The snow was 4 feet deep in places, drifted into mountains by the wind. The temperature was still well below zero, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. The sky was a brilliant, merciless blue, and everywhere she looked, there was destruction. The barn behind the farmhouse had partially collapsed under the weight of snow. The fences were buried completely. A dead horse lay frozen in the field, its legs splayed at unnatural angles. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from what remained of the Henderson farm, their house apparently destroyed by fire. Cordelia stood at the edge of the well, her breath forming clouds of ice in the frozen air, and felt the magnitude of what had happened settling over her like a shroud. This was not just a storm, this was a catastrophe. The news came to her in fragments over the following days. From her hidden vantage point, Cordelia watched the survivors struggle to dig out from the disaster. She saw wagons carrying bodies wrapped in canvas. She heard distant voices raised in grief and recrimination. She learned through overheard conversations the terrible scope of the storm's destruction. Jasper Tanner, the young man who had bet $5 that Cordelia would die before Christmas, had lost 2 fingers to frostbite while trying to reach his family's livestock. His mother was in serious condition, her lungs damaged by the cold. 3 children from the schoolhouse in town had died when they became lost trying to walk home, found frozen just 50 yards from their front doors. Dr. Phineas Mercer's clinic had been overwhelmed. The windows had blown out during the storm, and 2 of his patients had died from exposure before he could move them to safety. The doctor himself had frostbitten ears and was in a state of shock that bordered on complete breakdown. Opal Beckford's family had run out of firewood on the second day. Her husband had tried to reach the woodpile behind their house and had collapsed in the snow. Opal had found him barely alive, dragged him back inside, and spent 2 days burning furniture to keep him warm. He would survive, but his feet were badly damaged. The doctors were talking about amputation, And through it all, 20 feet below the frozen surface of her abandoned farm, Cordelia Ashford had been warm and safe, her chamber holding steady at 48 degrees, while the world above turned to ice. The children's blizzard of 1888 killed 235 people across the Great Plains. It came without warning on a warm January day, and it left devastation in its wake. But beneath the frozen ground of Haskell County, one woman survived because she had listened to her husband, trusted his knowledge, and built herself a shelter that worked exactly as he had promised. Cordelia was safe, but the people who had called her crazy were not, and they were about to come knocking. The knock came on the morning of January 20th. Cordelia was preparing her breakfast when she heard it, a rhythmic tapping on the well cover, too deliberate to be accidental. Someone was up there. Someone knew. She climbed the rope ladder slowly, her heart pounding, and pushed the cover aside just enough to see who was waiting. Opal Beckford stood at the edge of the well, her face ravaged by exhaustion and grief. Her clothes were dirty, her hair uncombed, and her eyes had the wild look of someone pushed past all normal limits of endurance. Behind her stood her two children, Thomas, 8 years old, and little Eliza, just 5. They were bundled in every piece of clothing their mother could find, their small faces pale and frightened. "Cordelia," Opal's voice cracked on the name. "I know you're down there. Hetty Briggs told me. She said you might be able to help." Cordelia said nothing. The memory of Opal's betrayal was still fresh. The knowledge that this woman had reported her plans to Hutchins had contributed to her downfall. "My husband is dying." Opal's composure finally broke, tears streaming down her wind-burned cheeks. "His feet are black with frostbite. The doctor says there's nothing more he can do, and we're out of food, out of firewood, out of everything. The children haven't eaten properly in 3 days." Still, Cordelia remained silent. "I know what I did." Opal's voice dropped to a whisper. "I know I told Hutchins about your plans. I was scared, Cordelia. My husband owed money too. Hutchins promised to forgive our debt if I gave him information. I thought I was protecting my family." She fell to her knees in the snow, her body shaking with sobs. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. And now my children are going to die unless someone helps us. Please, Cordelia. Please, I'm begging you." Little Eliza began to cry, a thin, weak sound that cut through the frozen air like a knife. The child was clearly sick, her face flushed with fever despite the bitter cold. Cordelia looked at the woman who had betrayed her, at the children who were innocent of their mother's sins. She thought about Ezra, about what he would have done in this moment. She thought about the kind of person she wanted to be when this was all over. Then she lowered the rope ladder. "Bring them down, quickly, before someone sees." The chamber that had seemed spacious for one woman and a dog became impossibly crowded with 4 additional people. Opal and her children descended the ladder in a state of wonder, their eyes wide at the sight of the underground room, with its stone walls and warm stove and shelves of food. Little Eliza stopped crying almost immediately, her small body responding to the warmth like a flower turning toward the sun. "How is this possible?" Opal whispered, looking around at the impossible shelter. "How did you do this?" "My husband taught me," Cordelia said shortly. "Sit by the stove. I'll make some soup." She heated water and made a thin broth from dried beans and salt pork, stretching her supplies to feed the unexpected guests. The children ate with desperate hunger, their small hands trembling as they held the bowls. Opal ate more slowly, her eyes never leaving Cordelia's face. "I don't deserve this," she said quietly. "I don't deserve your help." "No, you don't, but they do." Cordelia nodded toward the children. "And I'm not going to let them suffer for your mistakes." Copper, the old dog, had shuffled over to where Eliza sat and was pressing his warm body against her side. The child had stopped shivering at last, her small hand buried in the dog's fur. "Can I pet him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Copper. He likes to have his ears scratched." Eliza began to gently scratch the dog's ears, and Copper's tail thumped once against the stone floor. For the first time in days, the child smiled. More survivors came that night. First was Jasper Tanner, the young man who had bet against Cordelia's survival. His right hand was bandaged, the 2 missing fingers a permanent reminder of the storm's cruelty. He came alone, having heard from Opal that the crazy widow's well was actually a refuge. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, standing at the well's edge with his hat in his hands, "I don't have any right to ask this. I said terrible things about you. I laughed at you. I called you a fool. I remember. I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything." His voice broke. "My mother is sick. She can't breathe properly. Our house is destroyed. We have nowhere to go." Cordelia looked at this young man who had mocked her, who had made sport of her desperation. She saw the fear in his eyes, the genuine remorse, the understanding that he had been cruel to someone who did not deserve it. "How many are you?" "Just me and my mother. My father died in the storm." Another death, another family destroyed. Cordelia felt the weight of it pressing down on her, the enormous scale of suffering that had descended on the county. "Bring her down, carefully. The ladder is steep." By midnight, there were 10 people in the chamber. Cordelia and Copper, Opal and her 2 children, Jasper Tanner and his mother. Young Emmeline Garrett, 17 years old, who had arrived with her own mother after their farmhouse caught fire. Old Hetty Briggs, who had come not to seek shelter but to help, bringing with her a basket of dried herbs and a lifetime of knowledge about healing. And Reverend Josiah Whitmore, the 65-year-old pastor of the Methodist Church, who had been making rounds to check on his congregation when the storm struck and had been directed to the well by Hetty. The Reverend had been the last to arrive, his face gray with exhaustion and cold, his hands trembling as he descended the ladder. He had spent the past 3 days trying to reach isolated farms, trying to bring comfort to the dying and hope to the living. He had seen things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, looking around at the impossible shelter with wonder in his eyes, "I confess I did not believe Hetty when she told me where to come. I thought grief had addled her mind." He paused, his voice cracking. "I was wrong. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. 10 souls in a space built for one, huddled around a small iron stove, sharing blankets and body heat and the warmth of survival. It was cramped. It was uncomfortable. It was, against all odds, alive. They stayed in the chamber for 6 days while the worst of the cold passed. Cordelia organized them with the efficiency of a general commanding troops. Sleeping arrangements were rotated so everyone got time closest to the stove. Food was rationed carefully, each meal measured to ensure the supplies would last. The sanitation chamber was used in strict rotation, with the wood-ash system proving remarkably effective at controlling odors, despite the number of people using it. The first 2 days were the hardest. The storm still raged above, the temperature outside hovering around 40 below zero. Some of the refugees had frost-bitten fingers and toes that needed attention. Hetty Briggs took charge of the medical care, using poultices made from her dried herbs and teaching Emmeline Garrett how to wrap bandages properly. Jasper's mother, a frail woman named Patience, who had never fully recovered from a bout of pneumonia 3 years earlier, wheezed constantly in the smoky air. Cordelia gave her the spot closest to the stove and made sure she had the warmest blankets. It was touch and go for the first night, but by the second day her breathing had eased. Little Eliza Beckford attached herself to Copper with the fierce devotion that only children and dogs truly understand. The old dog, who had been fading slowly since before the storm, seemed to rally in the presence of the child. He let her use him as a pillow, let her wrap her small arms around his neck, let her whisper secrets into his floppy ears. It was as if he had found one final purpose. In the evenings, they told stories. Old Hetty spoke of the storms she had survived in her youth, the blizzard of 1856 that had taught her to read the weather like a book. Reverend Whitmore shared passages from Scripture, finding words of comfort that seemed written specifically for this moment. Jasper's mother, when she felt strong enough to speak, told tales of the old country, of Ireland and its green hills and the families they had left behind. And gradually, something remarkable began to happen. The barriers that had separated them, the suspicions and resentments and petty cruelties of small-town life, began to dissolve. In the intimacy of the underground chamber, with death still howling in the world above, they rediscovered what it meant to be a community. On the third night, Cordelia explained the engineering to them all. "My husband learned this in the tin mines of Cornwall," she said, drawing diagrams in the dirt floor with a stick. The refugees gathered around, their faces lit by the warm glow of the lamp, watching with the fascination of people who have discovered that the impossible is actually possible. 20 feet below the surface, the Earth maintains a constant temperature, about 54 degrees in this part of Kansas, warmer than winter, cooler than summer. It's not magic, it's science. The Cornish miners figured this out hundreds of years ago. But how does the smoke escape without anyone seeing? Jasper asked, genuinely curious now rather than mocking. His bandaged hand rested in his lap, a permanent reminder of how wrong he had been. Cordelia showed them the hidden channel in the well shaft, the system of baffles that dispersed the smoke. She explained the ventilation, the insulation, the way the double wall ceiling trapped air and prevented heat loss. She told them about the night the pipe froze, and she had to climb out into the storm to clear it, about the 15 minutes that had nearly killed her. It's not magic, she repeated. It's knowledge. Knowledge that has been passed down for hundreds of years by people who understood the earth. My husband gave me this gift, and now I'm sharing it with you. Reverend Whitmore shook his head slowly, a look of wonder on his weathered face. Mrs. Ashford, I preached a sermon once about the foolishness of trusting in the wisdom of man over the providence of God. I believe I owe you and your husband an apology. No apology needed, Reverend. Ezra always said that God gave us brains for a reason. Using them is just good stewardship. Hetty nodded approvingly. The old ways always come back around. People forget, and then they remember again when they need to. Your Ezra was a wise man, Cordelia, and you were wise to listen. 10 people survived in a space built for one. They shared food, warmth, and stories. They learned that the woman they had called crazy was actually the wisest among them. And in that cramped underground chamber, something beautiful happened. They became a family bound not by blood, but by shared survival. A widow who had lost everything became the savior of those who had taken everything from her. Have you ever experienced something like that? A moment when strangers became the most important people in your life? A moment when forgiveness became more important than justice? Tell me about it in the comments, and keep listening to hear how Cordelia's story ends. They emerged on the morning of January 23rd, 1888. The sky was clear, the temperature had risen to a bearable 20 degrees, and the first signs of human activity were visible across the frozen landscape. Wagons were moving on the roads. Smoke rose from chimneys that had been dark for days. The county was beginning to dig itself out. One by one, the survivors climbed the rope ladder and stood blinking in the brilliant winter sunlight. Opal carried little Eliza, who had recovered enough to smile and wave at Copper as the old dog followed them up. Jasper supported his mother with an arm around her waist. Emmeline and her mother held hands, tears streaming down their faces. "What do we do now?" Opal asked, looking around at the devastation. Cordelia thought for a moment. "We help. We take what I've taught you, and we help others rebuild. And when spring comes, we do it again." The news of Cordelia's survival and of the 10 people she had sheltered spread through Cedar Bend like wildfire. Within days, everyone in the county knew the story. The crazy widow who wasn't crazy at all, the underground chamber that had saved lives when nothing else could, the woman who had welcomed even those who had betrayed her. People came to see the well, to peer down into the darkness and marvel at what one woman had accomplished. Dr. Phineas Mercer came too, his frost-bitten ears still bandaged, his professional pride in tatters. He stood at the edge of the well for a long time, saying nothing. Finally, he looked at Cordelia with something like respect in his eyes. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Ashford." "Yes, you do. I called you hysterical. I suggested you were mentally unwell. I was wrong." He paused, struggling with the words. "The Earth maintains a constant temperature at depth. It's basic geology. I should have recognized what you were doing." "Yes, you should have. Can you forgive me?" Cordelia considered the question. Dr. Mercer had been arrogant and dismissive, but he had not been malicious. He had simply been limited by his own assumptions about what a widow could accomplish. "I can forgive you," she said, "but forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. Remember that the next time someone comes to you with an idea that seems impossible." Jasper Tanner's confession came at the Sunday service 3 weeks later. The Methodist Church was packed with survivors, their faces still showing the marks of the storm's violence. Reverend Josiah Whitmore had struggled to find words adequate to the occasion, to address the grief and the loss, and the desperate gratitude of people who had watched their neighbors die. When he asked if anyone wished to speak, Jasper rose slowly from his pew. "I need to say something," he announced, his voice cracking. "I need to tell you all what I did." He walked to the front of the church, his bandaged hand visible for everyone to see. His mother sat in the front row, her breathing still labored, but her eyes fixed on her son with pride. "6 months ago, I bet $5 that Mrs. Cordelia Ashford would die before Christmas. I called her a crazy widow. I said she was building her own grave." A murmur ran through the congregation. "I was wrong." Jasper's voice grew stronger. "While I was laughing at her, she was building the only shelter in this county that could survive the storm. While I was making jokes, she was saving my life." He turned to face Cordelia, who sat near the back with Copper at her feet. "Mrs. Ashford, I called you a fool while you were building the only thing that could save us. I don't know how to apologize for that. I don't know if there are words big enough." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn $5 bill. "This is the money I bet against you. I'd like you to have it, not because it makes anything right, but because it's all I have to give." Cordelia rose from her pew and walked to the front of the church. She took the $5 from Jasper's hand and looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned to face the congregation. "I don't need your money, Jasper Tanner. What I need is for you to remember this feeling. Remember what it's like to be wrong about someone. Remember what it costs to underestimate people." She held up the bill. "I'm going to donate this to the relief fund for the families who lost everything in the storm. And I'm going to ask everyone here to do the same. Not because I'm generous, but because that's what Ezra would have done. That's what he taught me. When you survive something terrible, you don't hoard your luck. You share it." The offering plate that Sunday collected more money than the church had seen in years. Spring came late to Kansas in 1888, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a transformation. 12 families built underground shelters that year, using the techniques Cordelia taught them every Sunday after services. She drew diagrams, answered questions, walked properties to help people find the best locations for their own chambers. She charged nothing for this service, asking only that those she helped would help others in turn. Young Emmeline Garrett became her most dedicated student, spending hours in the chamber learning every detail of its construction. The 17-year-old had a natural aptitude for engineering, a quick mind that grasped concepts almost before Cordelia could explain them. "You're going to change things," Cordelia told her one afternoon. "You're going to teach people things I could never reach." "I learned from you," Emmeline said. "Everything I know came from you." "No, everything you know came from my husband, who learned it from his father, who learned it from his father before him. Knowledge doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to everyone who needs it." Virgil Hutchins left Cedar Bend in early April. The bank examiner who arrived from Topeka had discovered significant irregularities in his record-keeping. Loans called in prematurely, foreclosures conducted without proper legal process, and money that seemed to have vanished from customer accounts. Criminal charges were being discussed, but the real reason Hutchins left was simpler than legal troubles. He could not walk down the main street of Cedar Bend without being confronted by people who had survived because of the woman he had tried to destroy. He could not attend church without hearing Cordelia praised as a hero. He could not conduct business without potential customers turning away, choosing to take their money to the new bank that had opened in the next town over. Cordelia watched his wagon disappear over the horizon, heading east toward a life where no one knew what he had done. She felt no satisfaction in his departure, only a profound weariness. "He's gone," she said to Copper, who sat beside her on the porch of her newly rebuilt farmhouse. "He's finally gone." The dog thumped his tail once, as if he understood. 4 more years passed. Cordelia became something of a legend in Haskell County, the widow who had outsmarted death and saved her neighbors in the process. Strangers came to see her, to ask her advice, to marvel at the chamber that had sheltered 9 souls through the worst storm in living memory. She received all of them graciously, sharing her knowledge freely, never accepting payment beyond a simple thank you. The chamber remained intact beneath the old well, maintained and improved, ready for the next disaster that might come. In the spring of 1892, Cordelia Ashford fell ill with a fever that no amount of medicine could break. She was 64 years old. She had outlived her husband by 6 years, had survived foreclosure and blizzards and the small cruelties of people who should have known better. She had built something that would outlast her, a legacy of knowledge and kindness that would echo through generations. On her last night, she asked to be carried down into the chamber one final time. Emmeline Garrett, now 21 years old and married to Jasper Tanner, helped lower her on a stretcher improvised from blankets and poles. The old dog Copper had died 2 winters ago, but his spirit seemed to linger in the stone walls, in the steady warmth of the earth that never changed. "It's peaceful here," Cordelia whispered, looking around at the space that had been her salvation. Ezra knew. He always knew. She died before dawn, surrounded by the people she had saved, in the shelter her husband's knowledge had built. They buried her next to Ezra in the cemetery, behind the Methodist church beneath a stone that read, Cordelia Ashford, 1828 to 1892. She listened when others laughed. 86 years later, in 1978, a team of researchers from the University of Kansas discovered Cordelia's chamber while conducting a survey of historical homesteads in the region. The chamber was remarkably intact. The stone wall still solid, the wooden ceiling still sound. Temperature sensors confirmed what Cordelia had known a century earlier. The space maintained a steady 52 degrees regardless of the weather above ground. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, the lead researcher, stood in the chamber for a long time, marveling at the engineering. She had read the historical accounts, knew the story of the widow who had defied the children's blizzard, but seeing the physical evidence was something else entirely. "The techniques used here," she wrote in her report, "reflect centuries of accumulated knowledge from the tin mining communities of Cornwall, England. The ventilation system, the thermal mass of the stone walls, the careful orientation of the space, all of these demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of underground construction that rivals modern engineering principles." The chamber was preserved as a historical site, with a small museum built nearby to tell Cordelia's story. Every year, thousands of visitors descended the ladder to stand where 10 people had survived the unsurvivable, to feel the warmth of the earth that never changes. Cordelia Ashford trusted her husband's knowledge when no one else would. She built a shelter that saved lives. She forgave those who had wronged her and taught them the secrets of survival. And when she died, she left behind something more valuable than money or property. She left behind wisdom. "The old ways always come back around," Hetty Briggs said. "People forget, and then they remember again when they need to." Maybe there's someone in your life who has knowledge you should be listening to. Maybe there's an elderly person, a quiet neighbor, someone who seems old-fashioned but carries wisdom that could save your life. Don't wait until the storm comes to start paying attention. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your life who deserve to be heard, I'd love to know. Leave a comment below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that save us all. In the summer of 2015, researchers from the University of Nebraska conducted a comprehensive study of underground shelters built during the frontier period. They examined dozens of structures across the Great Plains, measuring their thermal performance and comparing them to modern building standards. Cordelia Ashford's chamber ranked among the most efficient they found. The R value of this construction, the lead researcher explained in a documentary that aired on public television, is approximately R40. That's equivalent to or better than most modern homes. Mrs. Ashford and her husband understood intuitively what we've spent billions of dollars learning with scientific instruments. The documentary included interviews with descendants of the people Cordelia had saved. Emmeline Garrett's great-granddaughter, a professor of engineering at Stanford University, spoke about the legacy that had shaped her family. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the widow and the well," she said, "about how one woman's refusal to give up had saved her whole family. I became an engineer because of those stories. I wanted to understand how such a thing was possible." Jasper Tanner's great-grandson, a retired teacher from Kansas City, showed the camera a worn $5 bill that had been passed down through generations. "This is the money my great-grandfather tried to give Mrs. Ashford after the blizzard. She wouldn't take it, so he kept it as a reminder. Every Tanner since then has held this bill at least once, has heard the story of what it means." He held up the bill, its surface soft with age. It means don't bet against people. It means wisdom comes from unexpected places. It means listen to the ones who seem crazy, because sometimes they're the only ones who can see the truth. The well still stands on the old Ashford property, now part of a state historical park. The chamber below has been reinforced and fitted with modern safety equipment, but the essential structure remains unchanged. Stone walls, wooden ceiling, the quiet warmth of earth that has held its temperature for millions of years. Every January, on the anniversary of the children's blizzard, locals gather at the site for a commemoration ceremony. They read the names of those who died in the storm, and they read the names of those who survived in Cordelia's chamber. They light candles and sing the hymns that Cordelia sang in the darkness. Amazing grace and rock of ages, and come thou fount of every blessing. And they remember a woman who was called crazy, who was dismissed and mocked and abandoned by her community. They remember how she answered cruelty with preparation, how she met betrayal with forgiveness, how she transformed her suffering into salvation for others. They remember Cordelia Ashford, the widow who went into the earth and emerged with life in her hands. The earth remembers. 20 feet down, the temperature stays the same all year. The Cornish miners knew this. We used to take shelter in the deep tunnels when the storms came. If anything ever happens to me, and you find yourself with nowhere to go, remember this place. The earth will keep you warm when everything else fails. Those were Ezra Ashford's words to his wife, spoken in the privacy of their home on an ordinary evening that neither of them could have known would matter so much. Cordelia listened. Cordelia remembered. And when the time came, Cordelia acted. That is the lesson her story leaves behind. Not the engineering, though the engineering was remarkable. Not the survival, though the survival was miraculous. The lesson is simpler and harder than any of that. Listen to the people who love you. Trust what they teach you. And when the storm comes, remember that you are not alone. The earth remembers. And so should we. Thank you for listening to the story of Cordelia Ashford and the Widow's Well. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue telling stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through faith, wisdom, and the courage to trust when everyone else doubted. Until next time, remember, sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that save us all.
When the world laughs at your plan, keep building anyway. Real strength isn't loud, it's steady, patient, and prepared. Trust the wisdom of those who loved you, even when they're gone. And when the storm finally comes, don't just survive alone. Share your shelter, your knowledge, and your hope. Because the bravest victory is turning pain into protection for others.